Hey guys, tonight we begin with something that will make you grateful for every modern convenience you've ever taken for granted. We're diving headfirst into what life would actually be like if you woke up tomorrow as a peasant in 14th century Europe, right in the middle of the Black Death. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll never complain about your morning commute again. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this: you close your eyes tonight in your warm bed with clean sheets, indoor plumbing, and the comforting glow of your phone charging on the nightstand. But when you open them again, everything has changed. The year is 1348. You're lying on a pile of straw that smells like it's been rotting for months. Your body aches in ways you didn't know were possible. And outside your tiny windowless hut, you can hear something that chills you to the bone. The sound of church bells ringing constantly, not for celebration, but for the dead. Welcome to the Black Death, the most catastrophic pandemic in human history. A plague so devastating that it wiped out between 30 and 60% of Europe's population in just 5 years. But here's what most people don't realize about this period. The plague wasn't even the worst part of being alive. It was just the final, brutal punctuation mark on a life that was already a daily struggle for survival. You see, we often romanticize the medieval period. We think of knights in shining armor, grand castles, and noble quests. But the reality for 90% of the population was something entirely different. It was mud, hunger, disease, and the constant gnawing fear that tomorrow might be your last day on Earth. So what would it actually feel like to wake up in this world? What would your day look like? How would you eat, sleep, work, and survive in an age where the average life expectancy was barely 30 years old? And most importantly, how long would you actually last? I've spent months researching this topic, diving deep into historical accounts, archaeological evidence, and first-hand testimonies from people who lived through this nightmare. What I found was both fascinating and absolutely terrifying, because the truth is, modern humans like you and me, we probably wouldn't survive a single week. But don't worry, I'm going to walk you through everything. From the moment you wake up in your medieval peasant body to the harsh realities of daily survival. We'll explore what you'd eat, where you'd sleep, how you'd work, and yes, how you'd try to avoid the plague that's literally killing everyone around you. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a survival guide for the most dangerous time in human history. And by the end, you'll understand just how incredible it is that any of our ancestors made it through this period at all. Your eyes crack open to the sound of roosters crowing, but there's no snooze button, no gentle wake-up alarm. Just the harsh reality that dawn means work, and work means the difference between eating today or going hungry. Again, the first thing that hits you isn't what you see, it's what you smell. Imagine the worst odor you've ever encountered, then multiply it by 10. Your straw mattress reeks of mold, human sweat, and something that might be rotten vegetables, or might be something worse, The air itself is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, animal waste, and smoke from fires that never quite burn clean. You try to sit up, and immediately your back screams in protest. This isn't the gentle morning stiffness you might feel after sleeping on a bad hotel mattress. This is the bone-deep ache of someone who's spent years doing back-breaking manual labor. Your hands are already calloused and cracked, your fingernails permanently stained with dirt that no amount of scrubbing could ever remove. The room around you is smaller than most modern closets, maybe 8 feet by 10 feet, with earthen floors packed so hard they might as well be concrete. There are no windows, just a small opening covered with an animal hide that does almost nothing to keep out the cold. The walls are made of wattle and daub, essentially sticks woven together and covered with mud mixed with straw, and yes, animal dung. It's surprisingly effective insulation, but it looks exactly as appetizing as it sounds. You share this space with your entire family, your spouse, your children, your aging parents if they're still alive, and quite possibly a few animals. Privacy is a concept that simply doesn't exist. In fact, the word privacy wouldn't even be invented for another few hundred years. Everything happens in full view of everyone else, eating, sleeping, arguing, celebrating, crying, living, and dying. Speaking of animals, that rustling sound coming from the corner isn't your imagination. It's probably a pig or a couple of chickens. Livestock doesn't live in separate buildings because first, you can't afford separate buildings, and second, animals generate heat. In a world without central heating, without insulation, without even glass windows, every source of warmth is precious, even if that source happens to defecate on your floor regularly. The floor, by the way, isn't really a floor. It's just dirt, covered with rushes or straw that gets replaced when it becomes too disgusting to tolerate, which, given medieval standards of hygiene, means it gets replaced very rarely. You're basically living on top of a slowly composting pile of organic matter mixed with food scraps, animal waste, and whatever else has fallen down over the months. But here's the thing that would probably shock you most about waking up in this body, in this place, in this time. You don't feel shocked at all. This peasant brain you now inhabit accepts all of this as completely normal. The smell doesn't bother you because you've never known anything else. The discomfort is just part of existence. The cramped conditions, the lack of privacy, the animals sharing your living space. All of it just is. Your stomach growls, and you realize you're hungry, not the kind of hungry where you think, oh, I should grab something from the fridge. You're hungry in a way that makes your stomach cramp and your head feel light, because you went to bed hungry last night, and the night before, and the night before that. In fact, you can't remember the last time you went to sleep feeling truly full. This is seasonal hunger, and it's as much a part of peasant life as sunrise and sunset. You see, the harvest ended months ago, and the next one won't come for months more. The food stores that seemed so abundant in September are now running dangerously low. Every meal is calculated, rationed, stretched as far as possible. And even then, there's no guarantee there will be enough to last until the next harvest. You can hear movement outside your hut. Your neighbors are waking up too, beginning another day of the same struggle. The sound of coughing carries on the morning air, and not the gentle clearing your throat kind of coughing. This is the deep, wet, rattling cough that means someone is very sick. In a world without antibiotics, without modern medicine, without even a basic understanding of how disease spreads, that cough might mean death is coming to your village. And then there's the other sound, the one you've been trying not to think about. Church bells ringing in the distance. They've been ringing almost constantly for weeks now, marking the deaths of people in the next village over. The plague, they call it. God's punishment for the sins of mankind. It started in the ports, brought by ships from distant lands, and now it's spreading like wildfire across Europe. You've heard the stories, whispered in terrified voices around cooking fires, people who were healthy in the morning and dead by evening. Black swellings in the armpits and groin that burst and ooze. Fever so intense it makes people hallucinate. Entire families wiped out in a matter of days, leaving houses empty and crops unharvested. But what can you do? You can pray, of course. You can hope that God will spare your village, your family, yourself. But mostly, you just have to keep living, keep working, keep surviving from day to day. Because in medieval Europe, survival isn't guaranteed. It's earned every single day through backbreaking work and sheer stubborn determination. You force yourself to stand up, every joint protesting. Your clothes, if you can call them that, are basically rags. A rough woolen tunic that scratches against your skin, linen undergarments that haven't been washed in weeks, and leather shoes that are more hole than shoe. Everything is patched and repatched, handed down through generations, worn until it literally falls apart. There's no bathroom to stumble to, no running water to splash on your face. If nature calls, you'll handle that outside, in a pit that serves the entire neighborhood. If you want to wash, you'll have to walk to the nearest stream or well, assuming it hasn't been contaminated by the runoff from the tanning pits or the bodies of plague victims. But first, breakfast, except there's no breakfast as we understand it. There's no variety, no choice, no consideration of taste or nutrition. There's whatever food is available, prepared in whatever way will make it last longest and fill the most stomachs. Usually that means pottage, a thick stew made from whatever grains, vegetables, and occasionally bits of meat can be scrounged up. The cooking fire needs to be rekindled from the banked coals that hopefully survived the night. Fire is precious because starting one from scratch is difficult and time-consuming. You don't have matches or lighters. You have flint and steel and a lot of hope. If the fire died overnight, someone will have to go begging coals from a neighbor, assuming their fire survived. Water has to be fetched from the well or stream. Wood has to be gathered for fuel. The animals need to be fed and tended. The garden plot behind your hut needs attention, though there's precious little growing in it this time of year. Every task that we handle with the flip of a switch or turn of a tap requires manual labor, planning, and constant vigilance. And all of this happens before the real work of the day even begins. Because you're not just struggling to survive, you're struggling to survive while fulfilling your obligations to your feudal lord who owns the land you live on, the crops you grow, and effectively, you yourself. This is the world you've awakened into, a world where every day is a battle against hunger, disease, cold, and despair. A world where the average person never travels more than a few miles from where they were born, where literacy is almost non-existent, where medical knowledge consists mainly of prayer and superstition, and where the Black Death is spreading like a shadow across the continent, leaving empty villages and mass graves in its wake. But here's what's truly remarkable about this scenario. Despite all of this, despite the unimaginable hardships and constant threat of death, people not only survived, but found ways to experience joy, love, community, and hope. They told stories around fires, celebrated harvests and weddings, formed deep bonds with their families and neighbors. They were incredibly resilient, these medieval peasants. They had to be. And as we dive deeper into this world, as we explore what your days would actually look like, how you'd work and eat and try to stay alive, you'll start to understand just how tough our ancestors really were. Because surviving as a peasant in Black Death era Europe wasn't just about avoiding the plague. It was about navigating a complex web of social obligations, economic pressures, and environmental challenges that would break most modern people in a matter of days. So take a deep breath of your clean, climate-controlled air and prepare yourself. We're about to explore what it really meant to be human in the most challenging time in European history. You stumble outside your hut, and the first thing that hits you is the cold. Not the kind of cold where you think, oh, I should grab a jacket. This is the bone-deep, soul-crushing cold that makes your breath come out in thick white clouds and turns your fingers numb within minutes. Medieval Europe in the 14th century was in the grip of what historians call the Little Ice Age, and winters were brutal in ways that would make modern people weep. The village around you is waking up, but it's not the gentle suburban morning you might be used to. There are no paved roads, no sidewalks, no streetlights that clicked off at dawn, but just muddy paths that wind between tiny huts, all of them looking remarkably similar to the hovel you just crawled out of. The ground beneath your feet is a mixture of mud, straw, animal waste, and things you really don't want to think about too carefully. Your neighbors are emerging too, wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth they can pile onto their bodies. Everyone looks older than they actually are. Hard work, poor nutrition, and constant exposure to the elements have a way of aging people rapidly. A 30-year-old peasant looks like a modern 50-year-old. A 50-year-old peasant, well, you probably won't meet many of those. Most people don't live that long. The first order of business is water, and this is where your modern sensibilities are going to get their first real shock. That clear, clean, perfectly safe water that flows from taps. It doesn't exist. The well in the center of your village is your lifeline, but it's also potentially your death sentence. This water isn't filtered, isn't treated, isn't tested for safety. It's just whatever has seeped down through layers of soil that are contaminated with everything from human waste to the runoff from animal pens. You wait in line with your wooden bucket because, yes, there's a line. Water is precious, and everyone needs it for drinking, cooking, and the occasional attempt at washing. The bucket itself is cracked and stained, passed down through generations, because replacing it would cost more than your family earns in months. When your turn finally comes, you lower your bucket into the dark depths and pull up water that's cloudy, slightly brown, and has things floating in it that you try not to examine too closely. This is what you'll drink today. This is what you'll cook with. This is what you'll use to try to clean your body and your clothes, though both of those activities are rare luxuries. The irony is that beer, weak beer that's barely alcoholic, is actually safer to drink than water. The brewing process kills many of the bacteria that make water dangerous. So yes, medieval peasants, including children, drank beer for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Not because they were alcoholics, but because it was literally safer than the alternative. But beer costs money, and money is something you almost never see. The medieval economy, especially at your level, runs on barter, obligation, and the eternal hope that you can grow enough food to survive another year. Coins are for merchants and nobles, not for peasants who measure their wealth in turnips and the occasional scrawny chicken. Speaking of food, your stomach is now cramping with hunger, and it's time to see what's available for the morning meal. You trudge back to your hut, sloshing precious water with every step, and survey your food supplies. The word supplies is generous. What you have is a sack of grain that's running dangerously low, some root vegetables that are more wrinkled than your grandmother's face, and maybe, if you're lucky, a piece of salted pork that's so tough and salty it could be used as a weapon. The grain needs to be ground into flour, but you don't have a mill. Mills are owned by the lord of the manor, and using them requires payment you can't afford. So you have a quern, a hand-operated stone mill that requires enormous effort to produce even small amounts of flour. Your wife and children take turns at this back-breaking work, grinding grain between two heavy stones until their arms ache and their backs scream for mercy. The bread that comes from this flour isn't the fluffy white bread you might imagine. It's dark, dense, and often contaminated with bits of stone from the grinding process. These stone fragments gradually wear down people's teeth, which explains why dental health in medieval Europe was absolutely catastrophic. By the time most people reach their 20s, they've lost several teeth. By their 30s, they might be lucky to have half their teeth left. But bread, even terrible bread, is the foundation of survival. It provides calories and fills stomachs, even if it doesn't provide much in the way of nutrition. A peasant family might consume several loaves a day, because when you're doing physical labor from dawn to dusk, you burn through calories at an incredible rate. The vegetables you have access to are limited and seasonal. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and onions can be stored through winter, but by spring they're sprouting, rotten, or both. Leafy greens exist only during growing season, and even then, they're often bitter and tough. The idea of a fresh, crisp salad is completely foreign. Vegetables are boiled into submission, often for hours, until they're soft enough to chew with worn-down teeth. Meat is a luxury so rare that when it appears, it's cause for celebration. Most peasants might eat meat a few times a year, during harvest festivals or after an animal dies of natural causes. Fresh meat spoils quickly without refrigeration, so when an animal is slaughtered, the entire village shares in the feast because there's no way to preserve it all. The cooking process itself is an ordeal. You don't have a stove with temperature controls and multiple burners. You have a fire pit, usually just a depression, in the earthen floor of your hut with a pot suspended over it. Temperature control means moving the pot closer to or farther from the flames. Multiple dishes mean cooking one thing at a time, or throwing everything together into that eternal pot of pottage. Pottage is the default meal because it's efficient. Throw in whatever grain, vegetables, and occasionally bits of meat you have available. Add water and boil it until it's edible. The result is a thick, porridge-like substance that's filling if not particularly flavorful. You eat pottage for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You eat it when you're sick, when you're celebrating, when you're mourning. It's the constant of peasant cuisine. Spices are almost completely unknown at your social level. Salt is precious and expensive. Herbs might be available if you know where to forage for them, and if the local lord doesn't forbid peasants from gathering in his forests. But the exotic spices that drove medieval trade routes, pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, those might as well be mythical substances. You'll live your entire life without tasting them. As you choke down your morning portion of pottage, trying not to think about what those lumpy bits might be, you can hear the sounds of the village coming to life around you. Children crying, animals lowing and grunting, adults coughing and calling to each other. It's a constant background noise that you've learned to tune out, but underneath it all, there's something else, an undercurrent of fear, because this isn't just any morning in medieval Europe. This is a morning in 1348, and the Black Death is out there, spreading from village to village like a slow-moving wildfire. You've heard the stories from travelers and merchants, entire cities abandoned, mass graves that can't be dug fast enough, priests who refuse to give last rites because they're terrified of catching the disease themselves. The plague hasn't reached your village yet, but it's coming. Everyone knows it's coming. The question isn't if, but when, and when it arrives, there will be nothing you can do to stop it. No medicine, no hospitals, no understanding of how diseases spread or how to prevent them. Just prayer, superstition, and the hope that maybe somehow you and your family will be among the lucky ones who survive. But survival means more than just avoiding the plague. It means fulfilling your obligations to your feudal lord, because failure to do so can result in punishment, eviction, or worse. It means working land that doesn't belong to you, giving away a substantial portion of everything you produce, and accepting that your position in life is fixed by God's will and can never be changed. The feudal system isn't just an economic arrangement, it's a complete way of organizing society. You are bound to the land and to your lord as surely as if you wore chains. You cannot leave without permission. You cannot marry without permission. You cannot even mill your grain or bake your bread without paying fees to your lord's mill and oven. In return, theoretically, your lord provides protection from bandits and enemy armies. But that protection is often more theoretical than real, especially when the enemy is an invisible plague that kills regardless of social status. Your day is about to begin in earnest, and it will be filled with backbreaking labor that would challenge the strongest modern athlete. You'll work from sunrise to sunset, pausing only briefly for meals and rest. You'll work in all weather, through rain and snow and blazing heat. You'll work when you're sick, when you're injured, when you're grieving, and at the end of this day, you'll collapse onto your straw mattress, exhausted beyond measure, knowing that tomorrow will bring exactly the same struggle, day after day, season after season, year after year, until your body finally gives out or the plague finds you. This is the reality of peasant life in Black Death era Europe. Not romantic, not noble, not simple, just brutal, grinding survival in a world that seems designed to kill you in as many ways as possible. But here's what's remarkable about human nature. Even in these impossible circumstances, people found ways to live, not just survive. They fell in love, raised children, told stories, sang songs, and held onto hope. They created communities and traditions that would outlast the plague and shape the future of Europe. As we continue deeper into this medieval nightmare, you'll discover just how tough and resourceful these people had to be. And maybe, just maybe, you'll gain a new appreciation for the incredible luxury of simply being alive in the modern world. As you finish your meager breakfast, wiping the last traces of pottage from your wooden bowl with a crust of stale bread, the reality of your work obligations begins to weigh on your shoulders like a heavy yoke. Because being a peasant isn't just about surviving from day to day. It's about surviving while fulfilling a complex web of duties and obligations that would make a modern tax code look simple. You see, in the feudal system, you don't just work for yourself. In fact, you barely work for yourself at all. Most of your labor, most of your crops, most of your time belongs to someone else. Your lord owns the land you live on, the crops you grow, and effectively your life itself. You're not quite a slave, but you're not free either. You're something in between, bound to the land by laws and customs that stretch back generations. The workday begins with a trudge to the fields, and this isn't a pleasant morning stroll through pastoral countryside. The path to your strips of farmland winds through mud that can suck the shoes right off your feet, assuming you're lucky enough to have shoes. Most peasants work barefoot for much of the year, their feet developing thick, calloused soles that can handle rocks, thorns, and frozen ground. Your farmland isn't a neat, fenced property with clear boundaries. Instead, it's a series of long, narrow strips scattered across the village's 3 large fields. This open field system means your crops are mixed in with everyone else's, divided only by small ridges of earth or bundles of sticks. It's incredibly inefficient by modern standards, but it ensures that everyone gets a fair share of both good and bad soil. But here's the cruel mathematics of medieval agriculture. Of those strips you work, only about 1/3 actually belong to you in any meaningful sense. Another 1/3 belongs to your lord, and you're required to work it for free, providing your labor as part of your feudal obligations. The final 1/3 might be church land, which you also work without compensation, because God apparently needs his cut too. So you're working 3 jobs simultaneously, except 2 of them don't pay you anything, and if you don't do any of them properly, you could face fines, punishment, or eviction. It's a system designed to extract maximum value from your labor while giving you just enough to survive, usually. The tools you work with would make a modern farmer weep with frustration. Your plow is made of wood with an iron tip, assuming you're prosperous enough to afford iron. It barely scratches the surface of the soil compared to modern equipment. Your scythe is dull and requires constant sharpening. Your hoe has a wooden handle that splinters your hands and a blade that chips and breaks regularly. Everything has to be repaired constantly because replacing tools is impossibly expensive. You become an expert at jury-rigging broken equipment, binding cracked handles with strips of leather, hammering bent metal back into shape on rocks. The idea of simply buying new tools when old ones break is as foreign as the concept of flying to the moon. The work itself is backbreaking in ways that would hospitalize most modern people within hours. Plowing behind oxen, If your village is wealthy enough to have oxen, means walking miles every day while guiding a heavy wooden plow through soil that fights you every step of the way. Sowing seed by hand means bending over constantly, scattering grain with practiced motions while trying to ensure even coverage across acres of uneven ground. Harvesting is perhaps the worst job of all. You're racing against time and weather, trying to get crops in before rain ruins them or early frost kills them. You work from before dawn until after dark, cutting grain with hand sickles, binding it into sheaves, loading it onto carts. Your back aches, your hands bleed, your muscles scream for relief. But the work doesn't stop because stopping means starvation, and all of this assumes the weather cooperates. Medieval Europe's climate is unpredictable and often hostile. Too much rain rots the crops in the field. Too little rain kills them before they mature. Late frosts destroy tender shoots. Early frosts ruin nearly ripe grain. Hailstorms can wipe out an entire year's work in minutes. You have no weather forecasts, no climate data, no scientific understanding of what causes these variations. You plant when tradition says to plant, harvest when tradition says to harvest, and pray that this year won't be one of the many when the crops fail and people starve. But crop failure isn't just a personal disaster. It's a community catastrophe that ripples through the entire feudal system. When harvests fail, peasants can't pay their rents and obligations. Lords can't collect their expected income. The entire economic structure starts to wobble, and guess who bears the brunt of that instability? The people at the bottom. Always the people at the bottom. Failed harvests mean increased obligations for the surviving peasants. If half the village dies from plague or starvation, the remaining half still has to fulfill all the same duties to their lord. The work doesn't decrease just because there are fewer people to do it. If anything, it intensifies. Your lord doesn't care that your neighbors are dead or that you're working twice as much land as before. He still expects his rents, his labor service, his share of the harvest. Medieval accounting is ruthlessly efficient when it comes to extracting value from peasants, and remarkably flexible when it comes to providing protection or support in return. Speaking of your lord, he's not some distant figure you never see. Medieval society is intensely local and personal. Your lord lives in the manor house, probably within sight of your fields. He knows you by name, knows your family, knows exactly how much you owe and when you owe it. This personal relationship makes the exploitation somehow both more bearable and more galling. He might be genuinely concerned about your welfare in the same way a modern farmer cares about his livestock. Your valuable property that needs to be maintained in working condition, but you're still property, still bound by laws and customs that treat you as something less than fully human. The legal system reinforces this at every turn. Peasants can't testify against nobles in court. They can't own certain types of property. They can't leave the manor without permission. They can't even mill their grain anywhere except at their lord's mill, where they pay a hefty fee for the privilege of turning their wheat into flour. These restrictions aren't just legal technicalities. They're daily reminders of your place in the social order, constant reinforcement that you are not free, will never be free, and neither will your children or their children. Social mobility is not just rare, it's literally impossible under the feudal system. You are born a peasant. You live as a peasant. You die as a peasant. But perhaps the most crushing aspect of peasant life isn't the physical labor or even the legal restrictions. It's the constant uncertainty, the knowledge that everything you work for can be wiped out by forces completely beyond your control. A bad harvest, a raid by bandits, a change in your lord's circumstances, a new tax imposed by the king, or now, the ever-present threat of plague. The Black Death has added a new dimension of terror to an already precarious existence. You might work all season to bring in a good harvest, only to die before you can enjoy it. Your children might help you in the fields all summer, only to be dead before winter. The normal cycle of planting and harvesting, the rhythm that has structured rural life for centuries, becomes meaningless when death can arrive at any moment. And death from plague isn't like death from old age or accident. It's horrible, agonizing, and often comes with social ostracism as people try desperately to avoid infection. Families abandon sick relatives. Priests refuse to give last rites. Entire communities can dissolve as people flee in terror, leaving crops unharvested and villages empty. You've heard the stories from travelers who've seen it firsthand. Bodies piled in the streets because there aren't enough living people to bury the dead. Mass graves that look more like construction sites than cemeteries. Churches packed with rotting corpses because no one dares remove them. The psychological impact of living under this constant threat is almost impossible for modern people to comprehend. Imagine knowing that you or anyone you love could be dead within days, and there's absolutely nothing you can do to prevent it. No medicine, no hospitals, no scientific understanding of disease transmission, just prayer, superstition, and desperate hope. Some people respond to this terror by becoming more religious, spending hours in prayer and penance, hoping to appease whatever divine wrath has unleashed this catastrophe. Others become fatalistic, figuring that if death is inevitable, they might as well enjoy whatever pleasures they can find. Still others flee, abandoning their homes and families, in search of places the plague hasn't reached yet. But you can't flee. Peasants are bound to the land, legally and practically. Where would you go? How would you survive without the support systems of your village? What would you eat? Where would you sleep? How would you protect yourself from bandits and wild animals? For most peasants, staying and hoping becomes the only viable option. The work continues because it has to continue. Crops don't plant themselves, animals don't tend themselves, and lords don't excuse feudal obligations just because there's a pandemic raging across Europe. If anything, the pressure intensifies as communities struggle to maintain productivity with decimated populations. You might find yourself working strips of land that belong to dead neighbors, trying to keep their crops alive, even though you'll never benefit from the harvest. The Lord's steward still expects the same total production from the village, regardless of how many people are left to do the work. The irony is bitter and inescapable. You're working harder than ever, under more stress than ever, to produce food you'll barely get to eat, for a lord who sees you as replaceable livestock, all while a plague that could kill you tomorrow spreads inexorably closer to your village. This is the grinding reality of peasant life during the Black Death. Not just survival, but survival while fulfilling obligations that benefit everyone except you, working land that isn't yours, giving away crops you desperately need, serving masters who view your death as an inconvenience, rather than a tragedy, and yet somehow people endured. They found ways to laugh, to love, to hope. They created communities strong enough to survive the worst pandemic in human history. They passed down knowledge and traditions that would outlast the plague and shape the future of Europe. But first, they had to get through each day, one brutal, exhausting, terrifying day at a time, just as you're about to do now, as the sun climbs higher in the sky and the real work of staying alive in medieval Europe begins in earnest. Because your morning is over and the day ahead promises nothing but backbreaking labor, constant worry, and the ever-present knowledge that this could be your last day on Earth. Welcome to peasant life in the 14th century. Try not to die. The sun is now fully up, and with it comes the harsh reality of your work obligations. But before you can even think about heading to the fields, there's the small matter of staying alive through basic daily maintenance. And in medieval Europe, even the simplest tasks are fraught with danger, discomfort, and the constant reminder that you're just one mistake away from disaster. First, you need to deal with your body's natural functions, and this is where your modern sensibilities are going to take another brutal hit. There's no bathroom, no toilet paper, no privacy, and definitely no hand sanitizer. What you have is a communal pit latrine that serves multiple families, located far enough from the well to hopefully prevent contamination, but close enough that the smell is a constant companion. The walk to this medieval bathroom is an adventure in itself. The path is muddy, slippery, and littered with the kind of obstacles that could easily result in a twisted ankle or worse. And remember, a serious injury in this time period isn't an inconvenience that gets fixed with a quick trip to the emergency room. It's potentially a death sentence. The latrine itself is basically a wooden plank with a hole cut in it, suspended over a pit that's probably deeper than you are tall. There's no lighting, no ventilation, and absolutely no consideration for comfort or hygiene. You do your business as quickly as possible, trying not to think about what might be living in that pit below, or what happens when it rains and everything overflows. For cleaning yourself afterward, you have a choice between rough leaves, if you can find any, strips of old cloth that have seen better days, or just accepting that medieval hygiene standards are going to take some getting used to. The concept of toilet paper won't be invented for centuries, and even then, it won't reach peasants for centuries after that. Hand washing is theoretically possible, but it requires a trip to the well or stream, and soap is a luxury that's far beyond your economic reach. Most peasants might wash their hands a few times a week, if they're particularly fastidious. Daily hand washing is simply not a concept that exists yet. This casual relationship with hygiene extends to every aspect of daily life. Your clothes haven't been washed in weeks, maybe months. The idea of changing clothes daily is absurd when you own exactly one set of work clothes and maybe one slightly better set for church on Sundays. You wear the same tunic, the same hose, the same undergarments day after day until they literally fall apart. Bathing is even rarer. Most peasants might have a full bath once or twice a year, usually in connection with major religious holidays. The rest of the time, you might splash some cold water on your face and hands if you're feeling particularly motivated. The medieval belief is that excessive bathing is actually unhealthy, that it opens the pores and allows disease to enter the body. This means that everyone, and I mean everyone, smells. But when everyone smells equally bad, it becomes background noise that your nose learns to ignore. The human capacity for adaptation is truly remarkable, even when what you're adapting to would horrify modern sensibilities. Your hair's another story entirely. It's unwashed, uncombed, and probably home to a thriving ecosystem of lice and the other parasites. Head lice are so common that they're just accepted as part of life. Everyone has them, from the lowliest peasant to the highest noble. The difference is that nobles can afford to have servants pick the lice out of their hair, while peasants just learn to live with the constant itching. Dental hygiene is a concept that simply doesn't exist. You clean your teeth, if at all, by rubbing them with a rough cloth or chewing on twigs. Toothbrushes won't be invented for centuries, and toothpaste is completely unknown. The result is that most people's teeth are yellow, rotting, and fall out at an alarming rate. By the time you reach your 30s, if you're lucky enough to reach your 30s, you'll probably have lost half your teeth to decay and gum disease. Dental pain is just another constant companion, like hunger and cold and the smell of unwashed bodies. But here's what's truly remarkable about human adaptability. This peasant body you now inhabit doesn't feel disgusted by these conditions because it's never known anything else. The smell doesn't bother you, the dirt doesn't make you uncomfortable, the lice are just part of the background noise of existence. Your immune system, assuming it's typical for the time period, is actually probably stronger, in some ways, than a modern immune system. Constant exposure to dirt, germs, and parasites has created a kind of biological armor that can handle routine infections that would hospitalize a modern person. But it's also completely vulnerable to new diseases, like the plague that's slowly spreading across Europe. The irony is bitter. Your body can handle the everyday filth and minor infections that would make a modern person violently ill, but it's defenseless against the one disease that's going to reshape European society. All that biological toughness means nothing when faced with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. As you finish your morning routine, such as it is, you can hear the village coming fully to life around you. Children are crying, not the brief complaints of modern children, but the deep, desperate wails of hungry, cold, uncomfortable little humans who have no idea that life could be any different. Dogs are barking, but these aren't the well-fed, well-groomed pets you might be familiar with. Medieval village dogs are half-wild scavengers, competing with humans for scraps of food. They're useful for hunting and protection, but they're also potential carriers of disease and parasites. The line between domestic animal and wild animal is much blurrier in this time period. Chickens scratch in the dirt around the huts, pecking at anything that might be edible. Pigs root through garbage and waste, serving as medieval garbage disposals. Goats and sheep bleat from their pens, if the village is prosperous enough to have them. All of these animals live in close proximity to humans, sharing space, air, and unfortunately, diseases. The soundscape of medieval village life is nothing like what modern people experience. There are no engines, no electrical hums, no air conditioning units. Instead, there's the constant background noise of human and animal activity. People talking, arguing, working, animals making their various sounds. The creak of wooden wheels on carts, the ring of metal on metal from the blacksmith's forge, if your village is large enough to have one. But underneath all this normal village noise, there's something else. A tension, an undercurrent of fear that colors every conversation and every activity. Because everyone knows that the plague is out there, spreading from village to village, and it's only a matter of time before it reaches here. The stories that filter in from travelers and merchants are increasingly terrifying. Entire cities abandoned as residents flee in panic. Mass graves dug by the few survivors. Churches packed with bodies because there's no one left to bury them properly. Ships arriving in ports with their entire crews dead, their cargoes rotting in their holds. Some villages have tried to isolate themselves, refusing to allow strangers to enter, posting guards on the roads. But isolation is a luxury that most peasant communities can't afford. You need to trade for things you can't produce yourself. You need news from the outside world. You need the social and economic connections that bind medieval society together. And besides, the plague doesn't respect boundaries or barriers. It travels with merchants and pilgrims, with soldiers and refugees. It spreads through trade routes and along rivers. It jumps from village to village, like sparks from a wildfire, and once it arrives in a community, it spreads with terrifying efficiency. The medical understanding of disease in this time period is based on a mixture of ancient Greek theories and religious superstition. Most people believe that disease is caused by bad air or miasma rising from swamps and rotting matter. The idea that diseases can be transmitted by fleas, rats, or human contact is completely unknown. This means that the precautions people take are not just useless, they're often counterproductive. They carry bunches of flowers or herbs to ward off bad air, not realizing that the real danger comes from the fleas living in their clothes and bedding. They gather in churches to pray for divine protection, creating perfect conditions for the disease to spread rapidly through crowded, poorly ventilated spaces. Some people have started wearing amulets and charms, believing that supernatural protection might succeed where natural remedies have failed. Others have turned to increasingly desperate religious practices, flagellating themselves or going on pilgrimages to holy sites, hoping to appease whatever divine wrath has unleashed this catastrophe. But for most peasants, there's no time for elaborate precautions or religious extremism. The work has to continue, plague or no plague, because stopping work means starvation, and starvation is a more immediate threat than a disease that might or might not arrive in your village. So you prepare to head out to the fields, knowing that you're about to spend the next 12 to 14 hours doing backbreaking physical labor in conditions that would violate every workplace safety regulation ever written. Your tools are primitive and dangerous. Your work environment is filled with hazards that could kill or maim you. And there's no workers' compensation, no sick leave, no retirement plan. If you get hurt, you work through the pain or you don't eat. If you get sick, you work through the illness or you don't eat. If you get old, you work until you die, because there's no other option. The modern concept of retirement is as foreign as the idea of space travel. But here's what's remarkable about the human spirit. Even under these crushing conditions, people find ways to create meaning, community, and even joy. They tell stories while they work, sing songs during the harvest, celebrate births and marriages and religious festivals with whatever resources they can scrape together. They form deep bonds with their neighbors because survival depends on cooperation. When one family's house burns down, the whole village helps rebuild it. When someone gets sick, the community rallies to help with their work. When children are orphaned by plague or accident, other families take them in without question. This isn't charity in the modern sense. It's enlightened self-interest because everyone understands that they might be the next ones who need help. In a world where disaster can strike at any moment, social solidarity isn't just morally good, it's essential for survival. The village you're part of is more than just a collection of huts scattered around some farmland. It's a complex social organism with its own rules, traditions, and hierarchies. Everyone knows everyone else's business, which can be both comforting and claustrophobic. Privacy is impossible, but so is true isolation. There's the village priest, who serves not just as the spiritual leader, but as one of the few educated people in the community. He can read and write, which makes him invaluable for recording births, deaths, and marriages, and for communicating with the outside world. He's also the closest thing to a medical professional you have access to, though his treatments are more likely to involve prayer and holy water than anything resembling modern medicine. There's the reeve, elected by the peasants to represent their interests to the Lord and to organize the community work that keeps village life functioning. The miller, if your village is prosperous enough to have a mill, who controls access to one of the most essential services in agricultural society. The blacksmith, whose skills with metal make him indispensable for maintaining tools and equipment. Each of these people has a role to play in the delicate ecosystem that keeps the village alive and functioning. And each of them is just as vulnerable to plagues, famine, war, and the 1,000 other disasters that can destroy medieval communities in a matter of days. As you walk toward the fields, your stomach still cramping with hunger despite the thin gruel you choked down for breakfast, you pass the small plot where vegetables are grown for the village. Even in early spring, there should be some signs of life, some green shoots pushing up through the dark earth. But this year, the plot looks sparse and struggling. Last year's harvest was poor, and the seed saved for planting this year is of questionable quality. Some of it may not germinate at all. Some of what does grow may be weak and vulnerable to disease or pests. The margin for error in medieval agriculture is almost non-existent, and you're already operating too close to that margin for comfort. The three-field system that organizes village agriculture is designed to maximize productivity while maintaining soil fertility, but it's not foolproof. One field is planted with winter crops like wheat or rye. One is planted with spring crops like oats or barley. One lies fallow, resting and recovering its nutrients. Next year, the fields will rotate, but the system only works if everything goes according to plan. And in medieval Europe, things rarely go according to plan. Weather is unpredictable. Pests and diseases can wipe out entire fields. Wars can disrupt planting and harvesting schedules. And now, plague can kill so many workers that there's no one left to tend the crops properly. You reach your assigned strips of land and survey the work that lies ahead. The soil needs to be turned and prepared for planting. Seeds need to be sown with careful attention to spacing and depth. Weeds need to be controlled before they can compete with crops for nutrients and water. And all of this needs to be done with tools that would be considered primitive by Bronze Age standards. Your plow is essentially a large, heavy wooden stick with a metal point. It breaks up the soil, but it doesn't turn it over the way modern plows do. That means you'll need to go over the same ground multiple times, breaking up clods by hand, picking out rocks and roots that could interfere with plant growth. The work is physically demanding in ways that modern people can barely imagine. You'll walk miles every day just in the process of plowing, guiding the plow behind oxen or horses if your village has them, behind other people if it doesn't. Your hands will blister and bleed from gripping wooden handles. Your back will ache from bending over constantly. And all of this assumes the weather cooperates. If it rains too much, the fields become muddy swamps that are impossible to work. If it doesn't rain enough, the soil becomes hard as concrete and equally difficult to break up. Medieval farmers have no weather forecasts, no climate data, no scientific understanding of seasonal patterns. They plant based on tradition and hope for the best. The seeds you're planting represent a massive investment of the village's resources. Every grain that goes into the ground is a grain that can't be eaten today. In a community that's already struggling with hunger, the decision to plant rather than eat requires incredible faith in the future. But without planting, there is no future. The cycle of agriculture is relentless and unforgiving. Miss a planting season, and you face starvation. Plant at the wrong time, and the crops fail. Plant the wrong things, and you don't get the nutrition you need to survive. As you begin the day's work, your hands already cramping around the wooden handle of your hoe, you can't help but think about the stories you've heard from travelers. Villages where the plague killed so many people that there was no one left to harvest the crops, fields full of ripe grain that rotted because there were no hands to cut it down. The waste is almost incomprehensible. All that work, all that hope, all that careful planning, destroyed not by weather or pests or war, but by a disease that kills with random, merciless efficiency. Families that survived the winter only to die when spring should have brought renewal and hope. You push these thoughts aside and focus on the immediate task at hand. The soil in front of you needs to be broken up, the weeds removed, the ground prepared for seeds that may or may not grow into crops that you may or may not live to harvest, because that's what peasant life is in the Age of the Black Death. An endless series of immediate tasks that must be completed, despite the knowledge that long-term planning may be meaningless. You work not because you're confident in the future, but because work is the only thing that stands between your family and immediate starvation. The sun climbs higher, and the real heat of the day begins to build. Soon, you'll be sweating through your rough woolen clothes, adding your own moisture to fabric that's already saturated with weeks of accumulated grime. But there's no time to rest, no time to seek shade, no time to do anything but work. Because in medieval Europe, time is not money. Time is survival. And every moment you waste is a moment that brings you closer to the edge of disaster that peasant families balance on every single day of their brutally short lives. The backbreaking labor continues as the sun reaches its peak, and by now your body is screaming in ways that would send a modern person straight to the emergency room. Your lower back feels like it's being stabbed with hot knives every time you bend over. Your hands are raw and bleeding from gripping rough wooden handles. Your shoulders burn from the constant lifting and digging. But you can't stop, because stopping means your family doesn't eat tonight. And they didn't eat much last night either. The heat is becoming unbearable, but your heavy woolen clothes can't come off. Modesty aside, exposing skin to the sun means painful burns that could become infected, and infected wounds in medieval Europe have a nasty habit of turning deadly. So you sweat through layers of fabric that trap moisture and heat like a personal sauna designed by someone who hates you. Those water breaks are few and far between, and when they come, you're drinking from the same contaminated well that serves the entire village. The water is warm, brackish, and has things floating in it that you've learned not to examine too closely. But it's liquid, and liquid keeps you alive, so you drink it gratefully and try not to think about what those mysterious particles might be doing to your digestive system. Around midday, you're joined in the fields by other members of your family. Your wife arrives carrying your youngest child, because there's nowhere safe to leave an infant in a medieval village. She'll work one-handed while balancing the baby, somehow managing to weed and plant while keeping a toddler from wandering into dangerous situations. Your older children, the ones who've survived infancy, which is never guaranteed, are put to work immediately. A 6-year-old can pick rocks out of furrows. An 8-year-old can scatter seeds with reasonable accuracy. A 10-year-old can handle some of the lighter tools. Child labor isn't exploitation. In this context, it's survival strategy. Every pair of hands, no matter how small, contributes to the family's chances of making it through another year. But even as your family works together under the blazing sun, you can't shake the growing sense of dread that's been building in your chest like a physical weight. Because the stories from travelers are getting worse, and they're getting closer to home. Yesterday, a merchant passing through mentioned that the plague had reached the market town just 2 days' walk from your village. 2 days' walk, that's nothing. That's close enough that you might have friends or relatives there. Close enough that people from your village regularly travel there for trade. Close enough that whatever killed half the population of that town could be in your village by the end of the week. The symptoms he described were horrifying. People developing painful swellings in their armpits, groins, and necks. Fever so intense it made them hallucinate. Skin turning black in patches, hence the name Black Death. And death, usually within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms appearing. But perhaps most terrifying of all was his descriptions of how the disease spread through communities. Entire families wiped out in a matter of days. Survivors fleeing their own villages in panic, carrying the disease with them to new communities. Social structures collapsing as people abandoned their obligations and responsibilities in desperate attempts to save themselves. Churches packed with bodies because there weren't enough living people to dig graves. Mass burials in hastily dug pits because individual funerals became impossible. Priests as dying faster than they could be replaced, leaving communities without spiritual guidance just when they needed it most. The economic disruption was equally catastrophic. Markets closing because there were no merchants left alive to run them. Crops rotting in fields because entire villages had been depopulated. Trade routes breaking down as fear made travel too dangerous to contemplate. And through it all, the terrible randomness of who lived and who died. strong young adults dropping dead while frail elderly people somehow survived, entire families destroyed while their neighbors remained untouched. No pattern, no logic, no way to predict or prevent the devastation. As you work through the afternoon heat, these thoughts circle in your mind like carrion birds. You try to focus on the immediate task of preparing soil and planting seeds, but it's impossible to ignore the question that haunts every medieval peasant. What happens to your family if you die? There's no life insurance, no social safety net, no government programs to help widows and orphans. If you die, your wife becomes completely dependent on the charity of neighbors who may not have enough resources to help. Your children could end up as servants or laborers in other households, if they're lucky. If they're unlucky, they could end up begging in the streets or simply starving to death. The feudal system provides no protection for families that lose their primary breadwinner. Your lord cares about the productivity of his land, not the welfare of individual peasants. If you die, he'll simply assign your strips to someone else and expect the same level of production. Your family's grief and hardship are irrelevant to the economic machinery that keeps medieval society functioning. This brutal calculus affects every decision you make. You can't afford to take risks that might injure you, even if those risks might improve your family's situation. You can't afford to get sick, even though the unsanitary conditions you live in make illness almost inevitable. You can't afford to challenge authority or demand better treatment, because the consequences of being labeled a troublemaker could destroy not just you, but everyone who depends on you. The afternoon drags on, and your hunger becomes a constant gnawing companion. The thin gruel you choked down this morning is a distant memory, and your body is burning through calories at an alarming rate. But there won't be another meal until evening, assuming there's enough food left to make one. Medieval peasants don't eat 3 meals a day like modern people. They eat when there's food available, and they go hungry when there isn't. Most of the time, there isn't enough. The gap between harvest and the next growing season is called the hunger gap for a reason, and you're right in the middle of it now. Your stomach cramps and growls, but you've learned to ignore it. Hunger is just another background sensation, like cold or fatigue or the constant ache in your joints. Complaining about it won't make food appear, and dwelling on it just makes the work harder. But the children haven't learned to ignore hunger yet. You can hear them crying as they work, thin wails that cut through the afternoon air like knives. It's the sound of small bodies pushed beyond their limits, of young minds that can't understand why they hurt so much, or why the adults around them can't make it stop. Your wife tries to comfort them while continuing her own work, but there's only so much comfort available when comfort requires resources that don't exist. You can tell stories to distract hungry children, but you can't tell stories that actually fill their bellies. The psychological toll of watching your children suffer from chronic malnutrition is something that modern parents can barely comprehend. These aren't kids who are occasionally hungry between meals. These are children whose growth is stunted by inadequate nutrition, whose immune systems are compromised by constant food insecurity, whose entire childhood is shaped by the reality of never having quite enough to eat. And now, with the plague approaching, even this inadequate existence is under threat. Because plague doesn't just kill individuals, it destroys the social bonds and economic relationships that make peasant communities possible. When people start dying in large numbers, the complex web of mutual obligations and shared resources that keeps villages functioning begins to unravel. Neighbors who might normally help each other through difficult times become suspicious of each other, wondering who might be carrying the disease. Families that would usually share resources in emergencies become focused solely on their own survival. The social solidarity that makes peasant life bearable, if not comfortable, dissolves under the pressure of mortal terror. You've heard stories of villages where the plague created such panic that people abandoned their own relatives. Husbands fleeing from sick wives, parents leaving infected children to die alone. The basic human bonds that hold society together snapping under pressure that no community was designed to withstand. The irony is bitter. Just when people most need support and cooperation, fear makes such cooperation impossible. The very thing that might help communities survive the plague, working together, sharing resources, caring for the sick, becomes too dangerous to contemplate. As the afternoon wears on, you notice storm clouds building on the horizon. In any other circumstances, rain would be welcome. The crops need water, and the heat has been oppressive. But timing is everything in medieval agriculture, and rain at the wrong moment can be as devastating as drought. If it rains now, while you're trying to plant seeds, it could wash away everything you've worked on today. If it rains too much, the seeds could rot in waterlogged soil before they have a chance to germinate. If it doesn't rain enough after the seeds are planted, they'll die in the hard, dry earth. Weather is one of the many things completely beyond your control, but your survival depends on it, absolutely. Medieval peasants become expert at reading natural signs, watching cloud formations and wind patterns, observing animal behavior for clues about what's coming. But even the most experienced farmers are often wrong, and being wrong about weather can mean the difference between eating and starving next winter. You work faster, trying to get more seeds in the ground before the storm hits. So your back screams in protest. Your hands are bleeding more freely now, but the urgency of the situation pushes you beyond normal limits. Because this might be your only chance to get this section planted properly, and every seed that doesn't get planted is food that won't be available when winter comes again. The wind picks up, carrying the scent of rain and the sound of thunder in the distance. Your children huddle closer to their mother, frightened by the approaching storm. Medieval people have a much more intimate relationship with weather than modern people do. When a storm can destroy your house, kill your livestock, or ruin your crops, every dark cloud is a potential catastrophe. But storms also bring their own strange mercy. The rain, when it comes, will provide relief from the heat and dust. It will wash some of the accumulated grime from your body and clothes. It will fill the water barrels and cisterns that your family depends on. Like everything else in medieval life, weather is simultaneously a blessing and a curse. As the first fat raindrops begin to fall, you gather your tools and hurry toward the shelter of your hut. The workday isn't over. There are still animals to tend, food to prepare, a dozen small tasks that keep a medieval household functioning. But the field work is done for now, and that's a small victory in a life where victories are measured in surviving one more day. The rain begins in earnest as you reach your door, and you pause for a moment to look back at the fields you've been working. Somewhere under that dark, wet soil are the seeds that represent your family's hope for the future. Seeds that may grow into crops that will keep you alive through another winter, or seeds that may rot in the ground, leaving you with nothing but hunger and despair. But that uncertainty is tomorrow's problem. Today's problem is getting through the rest of this day, making sure your family has something to eat tonight, and preparing for whatever challenges the evening might bring. Because in medieval Europe, each day brings new struggles, new dangers, new reasons to wonder if you'll see another sunrise. The plague is still out there, spreading from village to village like a slow-moving wildfire. But for now, it hasn't reached your community. For now, you're still alive, still working, still fighting for survival, one brutal day at a time. And sometimes, in a world as harsh and unforgiving as 14th century Europe, still being alive is the only victory that matters. The rain pounds against your hut's thatched roof like an army of tiny hammers, and water begins to drip through the worn spots where the straw has rotted away. You huddle inside with your family, listening to the storm rage outside, and try to calculate how much damage this might do to the seeds you just planted. But there's no time to worry about what you can't control. Your wife is already rekindling the cooking fire from the banked coals, and there are mouths to feed, assuming you can find anything to put in them. The evening meal, such as it is, won't prepare itself. The food situation is even more dire than this morning. What little grain you had has been stretched so thin that tonight's pottage will be more water than substance. Your wife adds whatever she can find, some wilted greens that might have been edible a week ago, a few turnips so shriveled they look like ancient fingers, and if you're incredibly lucky, maybe a scrap of salted pork that's been hanging in the rafters since last autumn. The children gather around the fire, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed from months of inadequate nutrition. In the flickering firelight, they look like small ghosts, their skin stretched tight over prominent bones. This is what chronic malnutrition looks like in the 14th century. Not dramatic starvation, but a slow, grinding hunger that never quite goes away. As your wife stirs the thin gruel, you can't help but notice how her own face has changed over the past months. The rounded cheeks and bright eyes of a woman in her 20s have given way to the sharp angles and dull gaze of someone who's been fighting hunger for too long. She's still young, but poverty ages people fast in medieval Europe. The meal, when it's ready, barely qualifies as food. It's a watery broth with a few soft lumps floating in it, seasoned only with desperation and the faint hope that it might keep your family alive for another night. You eat it slowly, trying to make it last, trying to convince your stomach that it's receiving actual nourishment. But even this meager supper is interrupted by sounds from outside that make your blood run cold. Voices calling in the rain, urgent and panicked, the sound of horses' hooves splashing through mud at dangerous speed, and underneath it all, a sound you've been dreading for months, the church bells ringing in the pattern that means death has come to the village. Your wife looks at you with eyes full of terror, because you both know what those bells mean. The plague has arrived. After months of living in fear, months of hearing stories from distant villages, months of hoping against hope that somehow your small community might be spared, the Black Death has finally found you. You crack open your door and peer out into the rain-soaked darkness. Torches flicker in the distance, carried by figures hurrying between houses. Voices call out names, searching for someone who isn't answering. A woman's scream cuts through the night, high and desperate. The sound of someone discovering that death has visited their home. This is the moment every medieval peasant dreaded above all others. Not just death itself, which was always a close companion in this harsh world, but the particular horror of plague death. Quick, agonizing, and seemingly random in its selection of victims. Within hours, your village will transform from a struggling but functioning community into a charnel house of fear, desperation, and social collapse. Neighbors will eye each other with suspicion, wondering who might be carrying the contagion. Families will barricade themselves in their homes, refusing to help even close friends. The bonds of mutual aid that make peasant life possible will dissolve in the acid of mortal terror. You close the door and turn back to your family, trying to keep the fear out of your voice as you explain what's happening outside. Your children are too young to fully understand, but they can sense the terror radiating from their parents. They huddle closer to the fire, as if the warmth might somehow protect them from the invisible death that's stalking their village. Your wife begins to pray, her voice barely audible over the sound of rain and distant screaming. These are the prayers of desperation, the bargaining with God that people resort to when earthly solutions have failed. She promises greater devotion, more frequent church attendance, donations the family can't afford, anything that might persuade the Almighty to spare her children. But even as she prays, you both know the terrible mathematics of medieval plague. In villages where the Black Death takes hold, mortality rates can reach 60 or 70%. That means most of the people you've known your entire life will be dead within weeks. It means your children have less than a 50-50 chance of seeing their next birthday. The psychological impact of these odds is almost impossible for modern minds to comprehend. Imagine knowing that most of your family, most of your friends, most of your community will probably be dead before summer ends. Imagine trying to plan for a future when the future itself has become meaningless. Some people respond to this overwhelming terror by becoming fatalistic, accepting death as inevitable and trying to find whatever pleasure they can in their remaining days. Others become frantically religious, spending every waking moment in prayer and penance. Still others simply break down, unable to function in the face of such overwhelming dread. But for most peasant families like yours, there's only one real option. Keep working, keep struggling, keep fighting for survival, even when survival seems impossible. Because giving up means certain death, while continuing to fight means at least some chance, however slim, of making it through. The rain continues to hammer your roof, and you can hear new sounds joining the chorus of disaster outside. The lowing of cattle left untended because their owners are dead or dying. The crash of wooden shutters torn loose by the wind. The splash of cartwheels as someone, probably the village priest, makes his rounds to offer last rites to the dying. You try to distract yourself by checking your meager supplies, taking inventory of what might keep your family alive if the village's normal support systems collapse. A small sack of grain, mostly empty, some root vegetables that are already showing signs of rot, A piece of cheese so hard it could be used as a weapon. Maybe enough food for a week if you stretch it impossibly thin. But food may be the least of your problems. If the plague spreads as quickly here as it has in other villages, there may be no one left to work the fields, no one to operate the mill, no one to maintain the basic infrastructure that keeps rural communities functioning. You could survive the disease itself, only to die of starvation when the economic system collapses around you. The children have finally fallen asleep, exhausted by the day's labor and lulled by the sound of rain on thatch. But you and your wife remain awake, listening to the sounds of catastrophe unfolding outside your door. Every scream, every prayer, every tolling bell brings the reality closer. Your world is ending. This is what it means to wake up as a peasant during the Black Death. Not just poverty, not just hardship, but the complete collapse of everything that makes life meaningful. The knowledge that tomorrow might bring not just hunger or cold or backbreaking work, but the agonizing death that's already claimed millions across Europe. And yet somehow, some people will survive. Some families will make it through this nightmare and live to rebuild their shattered communities. Some children will grow up to tell stories of the terrible time when death stalked the land like a hungry wolf. The human capacity for endurance, for hope in the face of hopelessness, for finding meaning even in the darkest circumstances, is perhaps the most remarkable thing about our species. Medieval peasants didn't survive because they were tougher or stronger than modern people. They survived because they refused to surrender, even when surrender seemed like the only rational response. As you sit in your tiny, leaking hut, listening to your village die around you, holding your sleeping children, and wondering if any of you will be alive next week, you're experiencing something that millions of your ancestors experienced. The absolute bottom of human existence, the point where survival itself becomes an act of defiance against a universe that seems determined to destroy you. This is the world you've awakened into. This is what it truly meant to be a peasant in Black Death era Europe. Not romance, not simplicity, not a connection to the natural world that modern life has lost. Just brutal, grinding survival in the face of forces beyond your control or understanding. But here's the remarkable thing about human nature. Even in this hellscape, even facing almost certain death, people found ways to love, to hope, to create meaning. They held their children close and sang lullabies. They shared their last crust of bread with hungry neighbors. They maintained their humanity, even when the world around them had descended into nightmare. Tomorrow, if you're still alive, you'll get up and face whatever horrors the plague has brought to your village. You'll tend to the sick if you can, bury the dead if there's anyone left to help you. Try to keep your family alive for one more day, because that's what humans do. We endure, we persist, we refuse to give up, even when giving up seems like the only sensible option. The rain is beginning to slow now, and the sounds from outside have grown quieter. Whether that's because the immediate crisis has passed, or because there's no one left to make noise, you'll find out in the morning. For now, you pull your thin blanket closer around your shoulders and try to get some rest. The dawn breaks gray and cold over a village transformed by horror. As you step outside your hut, the sight that greets you would haunt anyone's dreams for eternity. Bodies lie where they fell, some twisted in their final agony, others peaceful as if they'd simply chosen to sleep in the mud. The smell of death mingles with the lingering scent of rain and smoke from fires that burned all night as people tried desperately to purify the air they believed was killing them. Your neighbor's door hangs open, creaking in the morning breeze. Inside, you can see a family of 5, all dead, their skin mottled with the telltale black patches that give this plague its name. The youngest, a girl barely older than your own daughter, still clutches a wooden doll carved by her father just weeks ago. Now both father and child lie still, claimed by a disease that makes no distinction between innocence and guilt. The village well, your lifeline for clean water, is now surrounded by bodies of people who collapsed while trying to fetch what they thought might be their last drink. No one dares approach it now. The water that was already questionable has become a death trap, potentially contaminated by the fluids seeping from corpses. But perhaps most terrifying of all is the silence. No children laughing, no adults calling to each other across the muddy paths, no animals lowing in their pens, because most of them have either died from neglect or been slaughtered by desperate families, hoping to preserve meat before it's spoiled. The soundscape of village life has been replaced by an eerie quiet, broken only by the buzz of flies and the occasional groan from someone not quite dead yet. You count the houses as you walk through what remains of your community. Of the 32 families that were here yesterday morning, maybe 8 or 9 dwellings still show signs of life. Thin wisps of smoke rising from chimneys. The occasional movement behind shuttered windows. A child's cough echoing from behind closed doors, though whether that cough means recovery or the first stages of infection, no one can say. The church bells that rang so frantically last night have fallen silent, and when you peer through the heavy wooden doors, you understand why. Father Thomas lies sprawled across his own altar, his arms outstretched as if he died trying to embrace the cross that was supposed to protect him. The man who baptized your children, who married you to your wife, who promised that God would provide for the faithful, has been abandoned by the very deity he served so devotedly. This is perhaps the most soul-crushing aspect of the Black Death for medieval minds. It's not just a medical catastrophe, it's a spiritual one. Everything these people believed about divine justice, about the reward for faithful living, about God's protection of the innocent, has been shattered by a disease that kills without regard for virtue or sin. Some of the survivors you encounter have already begun to crack under the psychological pressure. Old Margaret, who used to sell eggs in the village square, wanders aimlessly between the corpses, calling out names of her dead grandchildren and offering invisible food to people who can no longer eat. The blacksmith's apprentice sits motionless beside his master's forge, staring at nothing, his mind apparently unable to process the destruction of everything he once knew. Others have retreated into desperate religiosity, flagellating themselves with strips of leather or sharp stones, convinced that more suffering might appease whatever divine wrath has been unleashed. They crawl on their knees from house to house, praying over the dead and begging forgiveness for sins they may never have committed. But you don't have the luxury of madness or religious ecstasy. Your children are still alive, still depending on you, and that means you have to function regardless of the horror surrounding you. The practical needs of survival don't pause for grief or shock or existential crisis. The first challenge is water. With the village well potentially contaminated and no one left to maintain alternative sources, you'll need to find clean water somewhere else. That means a dangerous journey to the stream that runs through the woods. Dangerous because you don't know what you might encounter along the way. Other desperate survivors willing to kill for resources. Wild animals emboldened by the sudden absence of human activity, or simply the risk of getting lost in terrain you've rarely explored, because peasants in medieval Europe typically live their entire lives within a few miles of where they were born. Then there's food. The grain stores that were already running low are now completely inaccessible. The families that controlled them are dead, and their supplies are either spoiling or being fought over by the few survivors. The vegetable plots that might have provided sustenance are trampled and ruined. Even if you could access them, there's no guarantee the produce isn't contaminated by runoff from decomposing bodies. Your only hope might be to venture into the Lord's domain, the land that was strictly forbidden to peasants under normal circumstances. But these aren't normal circumstances. With the social order completely collapsed, with no steward to enforce the Lord's will, and possibly no Lord left alive to care, the old rules no longer apply. You might be able to find grain in the manor house stores or fruit trees in the Lord's private orchard, but this decision comes with its own terrible calculus. If you're caught stealing from noble lands, the traditional punishment is death or mutilation. On the other hand, if you don't find food somewhere, death from starvation is certain. It's a choice between possible execution and inevitable starvation, and for a parent trying to keep children alive, the mathematics are simple. As you make your way back to your family, you pass the house where the village's only literate person used to live. The scribe who kept records, wrote letters for those who couldn't write, and served as a link between your isolated community and the wider world. His door is barred from the inside, and when you peer through a crack in the shutters, you can see him huddled in a corner, still alive but clearly in the final stages of the plague. In his delirium, he's scrawling words on pieces of bark and scraps of cloth with charcoal from his dead fire. You can't read what he's writing, but you recognize the desperate urgency in his movements. He's trying to leave some record of what happened here, some testimony that your village existed and died. When he's gone, any history of your community dies with him, because no one else can read or write. This is how entire civilizations vanish from the historical record, not through dramatic conquests or natural disasters that leave obvious ruins, but through the quiet death of the few people who knew how to preserve knowledge. Your village, with its generations of accumulated wisdom about farming, weather patterns, local customs, and family histories, will disappear as completely as if it had never existed. You return to your hut to find your wife trying to keep the children calm and distracted. She's teaching them a song she learned as a child, something about spring flowers and gentle rain, anything to focus their minds on beauty instead of the horror just outside their door. But even as she sings, you can see the terror in her eyes, the knowledge that she's probably singing to children who will be dead within days. The hardest part isn't even the immediate physical dangers, it's the complete collapse of hope for the future. The seeds you planted yesterday are meaningless now because there may be no one left to harvest them. The plans you had for your children's lives, modest as they were, have been erased. The entire framework of meaning that structured peasant existence, work hard, provide for your family, serve God, and maybe your children will have slightly better lives than you did, has been revealed as an illusion. Yet somehow, you have to keep going. You have to find water and food. You have to protect your family from disease, starvation, and the breakdown of social order. You have to maintain some semblance of normal life for children who need stability even in the midst of apocalypse. This is the ultimate test of human resilience, not just surviving physical hardship, but maintaining humanity in the face of complete civilizational collapse. It's a test that millions of our ancestors faced during the Black Death, and the fact that we exist at all proves that some of them passed it. The sun climbs higher, and you realize you have a choice to make. You can barricade yourselves in your hut and hope the plague passes by, risking death from starvation or thirst. Or you can venture out into this transformed world and try to actively survive, risking exposure to disease, but maintaining some agency over your family's fate. There's no good choice. There's only the choice between certain doom and uncertain hope. And as you look at your children's faces, gaunt with hunger, but still bright with the stubborn optimism of youth, you know which path you have to take, because this is what it means to be human in the darkest of times. Not just to survive, but to choose survival again and again, even when the odds are impossible and the future is unimaginable. Your ancestors who lived through the Black Death didn't have superhuman strength or courage. They just had the same stubborn refusal to surrender that defines our species at its best. Tomorrow, if you're still alive, you'll face new horrors and new impossible choices. But tonight, you're still breathing. Your children are still with you. And in a world where half the population is already dead, that's not just survival, that's victory.